the pace increases as we start racing to the final conclusion of the story. In part 14, the signs of travel end in the remains of 4 of the old ones, shaking the explorers from their trance of curiosity and causing them to flee. If you want to hear more, please click like, subscribing, clicking the bell, then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. Though this cavern was natural in appearance and inspection with both torches suggested that it had been formed by the artificial destruction of several walls between adjacent honeycombs. The walls were rough and the high vaulted roof was thick with stalactites, but the solid rock floor had been smoothed off and was free from all debris, detritus, or even dust to a positively abnormal extent. Except for the avenue through which we had come, this was true of all the floors of all the great galleries opening from it, and the singularity of the condition was such as to set us vainly puzzling. The curious new fettle which had supplemented the nameless scent was excessively pungent here, so much that it destroyed all trace of the other. Something about this whole place, with its polished and almost glistening floor, struck us as more vaguely baffling and horrible than any of the monstrous things we had previously encountered. The regularity of the passage immediately ahead prevented all confusion as to the right course amidst its plethora of equally great cave mouths. Nevertheless, we resolved to resume our paper trail blazing if any further complexity should develop, for dust tracks of course could no longer be expected. Upon resuming our direct progress, we cast a beam of torchlight over the tunnel walls and stopped short in amazement at the supremely radical change which had come over the carvings in this part of the passage. We realized, of course, the great decadence of the old one sculpture at the time of tunneling, and had indeed noticed the inferior workmanship of the arabesques in the sketches behind us. But now, in this deeper section, beyond the cavern, there was a sudden difference wholly transcending explanation. A difference in basic nature as well as in mere quality, and involving so profound and calamitous a degradation of skill that nothing in the hitherto observed rate of decline could have led one to expect it. This new and degenerate work was of course bold and wholly lacking in delicacy of detail. It was countersunk with exaggerated depth in bands following the same general line as the sparse cartouches of the earlier sections, but the height of the reliefs did not reach the level of the general surface. Danforth had the idea that it was a second carving, a sort of palimpsest formed after the obliteration of a previous design. In nature, it was wholly decorative and conventional, and consisted of crude spirals and angles roughly following the quintile mathematical tradition of the old ones, yet seeming more like a parody than a perpetuation of that tradition. Since we could not afford to spend any considerable time in study, we resumed our advance after a cursory look. We saw and heard fewer penguins, but though we caught a vague suspicion of an infinitely distant chorus of them somewhere deep within the earth, the new and inexplicable odour was abominably strong, and we could detect scarcely a sign of that other nameless scent. Puffs of visible vapour ahead bespoke increasing contrasts in temperature, and the relative nearness of the sunless sea cliffs of the great abyss. Then, quite unexpectedly, we saw certain obstructions in the polished floor ahead, obstructions which were quite definitely not penguins, and turned on our second torch after making sure the objects were quite stationary. Still another time, I have come to a place where it is very difficult to proceed. I ought to be hardened by this stage, but there are some experiences and intimations which scar too deeply to permit of healing, and leave only such added sensitiveness that memory re-inspired all the original horror. We saw, as I've said, certain obstructions on the polished floor ahead, and I may add that our nostrils were assailed almost simultaneously by a very curious intensification of the strange prevailing fetor, now quite plainly mixed with the nameless stench of those others which had gone before us. The light of the second torch left no doubt of what the obstructions were, and we dared approach them only because we could see, even from a distance, that they were quite as past all harming power as had been the 6 similar specimens unearthed from the monstrous star-mounded graves at Poor Lake's camp. They were indeed as lacking in completeness as most of those we had unearthed, though it grew plain from the thick, dark green pool gathering around them that their incompleteness was of infinitely greater recency. There seemed to be only 4 of them, whereas Lake's bulletins would have suggested no less than 8 as forming the group which had preceded us. To find them in this state was wholly unexpected, and we wondered what sort of monstrous struggle had occurred down here in the dark. Penguins attacked in a body? Retaliate savagely with their beaks? And our ears now made certain the existence of a rookery far beyond. Had those others disturbed such a place and aroused murderous pursuit? The obstructions did not suggest it, for penguin beaks against the tough tissue Lake had dissected could hardly account for the terrible damage our approaching glance was beginning to make out. Besides, the huge blind birds we had seen appeared to be singularly peaceful. Had there then been a struggle among those others, and were the absent 4 responsible? If so, where were they? Were they close at hand and likely to return to form an immediate menace to us? We glanced anxiously at some of the smooth-floored lateral passages as we continued our slow and frankly reluctant approach. Whatever the conflict was, it had clearly been that which had frightened the penguins into their unaccustomed wandering. It must then have arisen near that faintly heard rookery in the incalculable gulf beyond, since there were no signs that any birds had normally dwelt here. Perhaps, we reflected, there had been a hideous running fight, with the weaker party seeking to get back to the caged sledges where their pursuers finished them. One could picture the demonic fray between namelessly monstrous entities as it surged out of the black abyss, with great clouds of frantic penguins squawking and scurrying ahead. I say that we approached those sprawling and incomplete obstructions slowly and reluctantly. Would to heaven we had never approached them at all, but had run back at top speed out of that blasphemous tunnel, with the greasy smooth floors and the degenerate morals aping and mocking the things they had superseded, run back before we had seen what we did see, and before our minds were burned with something which will never let us breathe easily again. Both of our torches were turned on the prostrate objects, so that we soon realized the dominant factor in their incompleteness. Mauled, compressed, twisted and ruptured as they were, their chief common injury was total decapitation. From each one, the tentacled starfish head had been removed, and as we drew near, we saw the manner of removal looked like some hellish tearing or suction than like any ordinary form of cleavage. Their noisome dark green ichor formed a large spreading pool, but its stench was half overshadowed by that newer and stranger stench, here more pungent than at any other point along our route. Only when we had come very close to the sprawling obstructions could we trace that second inexplicable fetor to any immediate source, and the second we did so, Danforth, remembering certain very vivid sculptures of the Old One's history in the Permian Age 150 million years ago, gave vent to a nerve-tortured cry which echoed hysterically through that vaulted and archaic passage with the evil palmipest carvings. I came only just short of echoing his cry myself, for I had seen those primal sculptures too, and had shudderingly admired the way the nameless artists had suggested that hideous slime coating found on certain incomplete and prostrate old ones, whom the frightful Shoggoths had characteristically slain and sucked to a ghastly headlessness in the Great War of Re-subjugation. They were infamous nightmare sculptures, even when telling of age-old bygone things, for Shoggoths and their work ought to not be seen by human beings or portrayed by any beings. The mad author of the Necronomicon had nervously tried to swear that none had ever been bred on this planet, and that only drugged dreamers had ever conceived them. Formless protoplasm, able to mock and reflect all forms and organisms and processes. Vicious agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids, infinitely plastic and ductile, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great heavens, what madness made even those blasphemous old ones willing to use and carve such things. And now, when Danforth and I saw the freshly glistening and reflectively iridescent black slime which clung thickly to those headless bodies and sank obscenely with that new, unknown odour whose cause only a diseased fancy could envisage, clung to those bodies and sparkled less voluminously on a smooth part of the accursedly resculpted wall in a series of grouped dots, we understood the quality of cosmic fear to its uttermost depths. It was not fear of those 4 missing others, for all too well did we suspect they would do no harm again. Poor devils. After all, they were not evil things of their kind. They were the men of another age and another order of being. Nature had played a hellish jest on them, as it will on any others that human madness, callousness or cruelty may hereafter drag up in that hideously dead or sleeping polar waste. And this was their tragic homecoming. They had not been even savages. For what indeed had they done? That awful awakening in the cold of an unknown epoch, perhaps an attack by the furry, frantically barking quadrupeds, and a day's defence against them and the equally frantic white simians, with the queer wrappings and paraphernalia. Poor Lake, poor Gedney, and poor old ones. Scientists to the last. What had they done that we would not have done in their place? Lord, what intelligence and persistence! What a facing of the incredible, just as those carven kinsmen and forebears had faced things only a little less incredible. Radiates, vegetables, monstrosities, star-spawn, whatever they had been, they were men. They had crossed the icy peaks, on whose tempted slopes they had once worshipped and roamed among the tree ferns. They had found their dead city brooding under its curse, and had read its carven latter days as we had done. They had tried to reach their living fellows in fabled depths of blackness they had never seen. And what had they found? All this flashed in unison through the thoughts of Danforth and me as we looked from those headless, slime-coated shapes to the loathsome palmy-pest sculptures and the diabolical dot groups of the fresh slime on the wall beside them. Looked and understood what must have triumphed and survived down there in the Cyclopean water city of that nighted, penguin-fringed abyss, whence even now a sinister curling mist had begun to belch pallidly as if in answer to Danforth's hysterical scream. That shock of recognizing that monstrous slime and headlessness had frozen us into mute, motionless statues, and it is only through the latter conversations that we have learned of the complete identity of our thoughts at that moment. It seems eons that we stood there, but actually it could not have been more than 10 or 15 seconds. That hateful pallid mist curled forwards as if veritably driven by some remoter advancing bulk, and then came a sound which upset much of which we had just decided, and in so doing broke the spell and enabled us to run like mad past squawking, confused penguins over our former trail back to the city, along ice-sunken megalithic corridors to the great open circle, and up that archaic spiral ramp in a frenzied automatic plunge for the sane outer air and light of day. The new sound, as I have intimated, upset much that we had decided, because it was what poor Lake's dissection had led us to attribute to those we had just judged dead. It was, Danforth later told me, precisely what he had caught in infinitely muffled form when at that spot beyond the alley corner above the glacial level, and it certainly had a shocking resemblance to the wind pipings we had both heard around the lofty mountain caves. At the risk of seeming puerile, I will add another thing too, if only because of the surprising way Danforth's impression chimed with mine. Of course, common reading is what prepared us both to make the interpretation, though Danforth has hinted at queer notions about unsuspected and hidden sources to which Poe may have had access to when writing his Arthur Gordon Pym a century ago. It will be remembered that in that fantastic tale there is a world of unknown but terrible and prodigious significance connected with the Antarctic, and screened eternally by the gigantic, spectrally snowy birds of that malign region's core. Tickily-lee! Tickily-lee! That, I may admit, is exactly what we thought we heard conveyed by that sudden sound behind the advancing white mist, that insidious musical piping over a singularly wide range. We were in full flight before 3 notes or syllables had been uttered, though we knew that the swiftness of the old ones would enable any scream-roused and pursuing survivor of the slaughter to overtake us in a moment if it really wished to do so. We had a vague hope, however, that non-aggressive conduct and a display of kindred reason might cause such a being to spare us in case of capture, if only from scientific curiosity. After all, if such a one had nothing to fear for itself, it would have no motive in harming us. Concealment being futile at this junction, we used our torches for a running glance behind and perceived that the mist was thinning. Would we see at last a complete and living specimen of those others? Again came that insidious musical piping. Tickily-lee! Tickily-lee! Then, noting that we were actually gaining on our pursuer, it occurred to us that the entity might be wounded. We could take no chances, however, since it was very obviously approaching in answer to Danforth's scream, rather than in flight from any other entity. The timing was too close to admit of doubt. Of the whereabouts of that less conceivable and less mentionable nightmare, that fetid, unglimpsed mountain of slime-spewing protoplasm, whose race had conquered the abyss and sent land pioneers to recarve and squirm through the burrows of the hills, we could form no guess, and it cost us a genuine pang to leave this probably crippled old one, perhaps a lone survivor, to the peril of recapture and a nameless fate. Thank heaven we did not slacken our run. The curling mist had thickened again and was driving ahead with increased speed, whilst The straying penguins in our rear were squawking and screaming and displaying signs of panic, really surprising in view of their relatively minor confusion when we passed them. Once more came that sinister, wide-ranged piping, "Tikili-lee, tikili-lee." We had been wrong. The thing was not wounded, but had merely paused on encountering the bodies of its fallen kindred and the hellish slime inscription above them. We could never know what that demon message was, but those burials at Lake's camp had shown how much importance the beings attached to their dead. So ends part 14 of At the Mountains of Madness, with the explorers running for their lives. In the final episode, they realise that their pursuer is far worse than the old ones, as they desperately sprint for the surface. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell, and think, when running, never look back. Getting to what is in front is far more important than seeing what is behind.